Alessandro Moretti, the most feared crime boss in New York, stepped into L'Eau Noir, and the entire restaurant held its breath. Every eye was fixed on the man who ruled the city's skyline. But his companion for the evening made a deadly error. She mocked the waitress. Tapping the wine list with a dismissive finger, she sneered with contempt. "She cannot even read the menu, Alessandro. It is absolutely pathetic." What she failed to realize was that this particular waitress possessed a secret, a truth powerful enough to incinerate their entire empire. When Sophie finally spoke, she did more than just read the menu. She left the devil himself speechless. This is the unbelievable story of how one spilled glass of crimson wine would fundamentally alter the criminal underworld for good. This is a story about a woman the world dismissed as nothing, who proved that the most dangerous weapon in any room is not a gun. It is a brilliant mind that refuses to stay silent. If you have ever been overlooked, underestimated, or told you do not belong, this one is for you. The rain falling on Manhattan never truly cleaned anything. It only made the city's filth shine. But inside the exclusive L'Eau Noir, the outside world and its weather were meaningless. The atmosphere inside was thick with the scent of inherited wealth, expensive truffle oil, and raw fear. At table 4, Sophie carefully polished the silverware, her fingers betraying a slight, uncontrollable tremble. It wasn't because she was cold, it was because of a gnawing hunger. She had not had a proper meal in 2 full days, getting by on the hardened baguettes that the sous chef, Jean-Luc, would discard out the back entrance after midnight. To the wealthy patrons of Lido, Sophie was merely a part of the decor. She was an indistinct shape in a black uniform and white apron, a silent specter holding a notepad. "Check your appearance, Sophie," the manager, Monsieur Laurent, hissed in her ear as he swept by. "Table 4 has been reserved. It is for the Moretti party." The mention of that name seemed to steal 10 degrees of warmth from the room. Sophie's body went rigid. Every person in New York City was aware of the Morettis. Their control had expanded far beyond the unions and the shipping docks. Now they owned the very skyline. Alessandro Moretti, the youngest and most brutal leader of the family, was a man whose quietest word carried more weight than a bomb. He was famous for 2 things: his terrifying, calculating silence and his unyielding demand for perfection. "I am ready, monsieur," Sophie murmured, carefully tucking an escaped strand of honey-colored hair behind her ear. She kept her gaze fixed on the floor. That was the most important rule. Keep your head down, and you might stay alive. Precisely at 8 o'clock in the evening, the massive oak doors of the restaurant swung inward. The dining room, which usually buzzed with refined conversation and the delicate sound of crystal glasses, plunged into an absolute, profound silence. It felt as if all the oxygen had been vacuumed from the space. Alessandro Moretti entered first. He was much taller in person than he appeared in the tabloid photographs, dressed in a custom-made charcoal suit that probably cost more than everything Sophie had ever earned. His face was a perfect sculpture of bored disinterest, with a jawline so sharp it looked like it could slice through steel. His eyes were dark, incredibly intelligent, and utterly empty of any warmth. Following closely behind him were 2 bodyguards, enormous men who seemed to be chiseled from solid stone, and a woman. The woman was breathtaking, in the same way a large diamond is breathtaking, cold, brilliant, and created to be admired from a distance. She was poured into a scarlet dress that fit her like a second skin. This was Camilla Vans. No, that was her old name. Now she was Camilla Russo, a socialite desperately trying to secure an engagement ring before the end of the business year. "This way, signore." Laurent bowed so deeply that his nose almost touched the polished floor. They were guided to table 4, which was in Sophie's section. She waited the professionally required 30 seconds before walking toward them. Her heart was beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs, like a caged animal. She had to keep this job. She desperately needed the tips. Her rent was already 3 weeks overdue, and her landlord, A clammy man named Mr. Henderson had explicitly threatened to change the locks on her apartment by Friday. "Good evening," Sophie said, her voice quiet but remarkably firm. "Water for the table?" Alessandro paid her no mind. He was looking at his watch, a classic Patek Philippe. He gave a small, dismissive wave of his hand. Camilla, on the other hand, looked directly at her. Her gaze traveled from Sophie's worn-out shoes all the way up to her slightly frayed collar, her lips twisting into a sneer of instant disgust. In Camilla's world, Sophie was not a human being. She was just a temporary distraction from Alessandro's complete attention. "Sparkling," Camilla commanded sharply. "And I want the wine list. The reserve list, not the cheap house selection." "Of course, madame." Sophie went to retrieve the heavy, leather-bound volume. When she came back, she placed it carefully on the table in front of Alessandro. He continued to ignore it. "Read it to me, my dear," he said to Camilla, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that seemed to make the air around Sophie hum. "I have a headache," Camilla complained with a whine. She opened the massive book, her perfectly manicured fingernails tapping impatiently on the aged paper. But as her eyes moved across the pages, her confident smile began to fade. The menu at L'Eau Noire was not just written in French. It was composed in an old, overly elaborate version of the language, with elegant cursive handwriting detailing obscure vintages and remote regions that a person would need a sommelier's license just to pronounce. Camilla's eyes narrowed in confusion. She turned one page and then another. She let out a strained, nervous laugh. "Well," Camilla said with a giggle, flipping her hair over her shoulder. "It is all simply French, is it not? Alessandro, why do we not just get the Cabernet?" "I do not want a Cabernet," Alessandro stated, lifting his head to look at her for the first time. His intense gaze seemed to pierce right through Camilla. "I want the 82 Bordeaux. Find it for me." Camilla's eyes darted frantically across the page. She jabbed her finger at a line completely at random. "Here, this is the one." Sophie leaned forward to pour their water. Her gaze unintentionally fell to the spot where Camilla's finger was pointing. That was not a Bordeaux. It was an inexpensive table wine from the Loire Valley, with its price drastically inflated for unsuspecting tourists. "Actually," Camilla snapped, noticing Sophie's brief glance. She felt exposed and foolish, and she immediately needed someone to blame. Why not ask her? Just look at her. Camilla laughed, a harsh, metallic sound that cut through the silent dining room. "She is staring at the page as if she is trying to figure out a difficult equation. She probably is not even capable of reading the menu, Alessandro. It is truly pathetic. These establishments will hire anyone they can find these days." The restaurant became so still it was painful. Other diners were frozen in place, their forks suspended in mid-air. Alessandro adjusted his position in his chair. He turned his attention to Sophie for the very first time. He truly saw her. He noticed the worn cuffs, the exhaustion in her eyes, the inexpensive shoes. "Is that correct?" Alessandro asked, his voice becoming dangerously quiet. "Are you unable to read this menu?" It was an impossible question. If she answered yes, she would be fired for incompetence. If she answered no, she would be arguing with an important guest, which was a career-ending move in her industry. Camilla's lips curled into a victorious smirk. "Of course she cannot. Go and find someone who actually knows what they are doing. Go on." Sophie stood frozen. The insult was a flash of white-hot pain in her gut. It was not just the cruelty that wounded her. It was the casual assumption that she was unintelligent. They looked at her and saw only a waitress. They saw a complete nobody. They did not see Sophie Dubois, the former star pupil of the Sorbonne, the daughter of a disgraced international diplomat who had spent all her childhood summers in the beautiful vineyards of Provence, long before her father's catastrophic gambling debts sent them fleeing into hiding in America. Sophie's hand tightened around the water pitcher. Her first instinct was to walk away. She should just go and get Lauren. But then her eyes met Alessandro's. He was not sneering with contempt like Camilla. Instead, he was observing her with a sharp, predatory curiosity. He was waiting, testing her to see if she would crumble under the pressure. Sophie took a deep, steadying breath. She placed the pitcher on the table. The sound was a soft, definitive thud against the fine linen. She turned her body to face Camilla, her posture transforming. The timid, submissive posture of the waitress completely disappeared. "You are mistaken, mademoiselle." Sophie's voice was utterly transformed. The hesitant American accent had vanished, replaced by the flawless, musical, and commanding tone of a native Parisian speaker. Camilla just blinked in confusion. "What?" Sophie went on, now fixing her gaze directly on Alessandro. She spoke in perfect French, so fluid and elegant that it sounded like a beautiful song. "That is a dry white wine, quite acidic, and it is usually served with oysters. It is most definitely not a Bordeaux. If the Signore wishes to have the 1982, he is searching for the Chateau Mouton Rothschild, which is located on page 14, the third entry from the bottom." She reached forward, her hand perfectly steady, and turned the heavy pages of the wine list with a single practiced movement. She stopped precisely on page 14. Furthermore, Sophie then switched back to impeccable, unaccented English, her voice now cool and utterly professional. "The vintage that you were indicating, mademoiselle, has a bad cork. Monsieur Laurent keeps that bottle on the list specifically to identify inexperienced tourists. I would never dream of serving it to someone with a palate as sophisticated as Mr. Moretti's." Silence. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the room. Monsieur Laurent, who had been rushing toward the table to manage the situation, came to a sudden, clumsy stop, his mouth hanging open in shock. Camilla's face became a deep, violent shade of red. She began to sputter. "How dare you have the audacity to speak to me that way?" Alessandro simply raised his hand, lifting a single finger. Camilla's mouth snapped shut as if by magic. Alessandro slowly shifted his gaze from the wine list and settled it on Sophie. The look of boredom had completely vanished from his eyes. It was replaced by something far more unsettling. He was interested. "You speak French," Alessandro said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. "I do," Sophie confirmed, holding his intense gaze without flinching. She was almost certain she was about to be fired. At this point, she did not care. "And you understand wine?" "I understand that serving a muscadet with a fine steak would be an offense against civilization, signore." The corner of Alessandro's mouth pulled up slightly. It was the barest hint of a smile. "What is your name?" "Sophie. Sophie." He repeated the name, tasting it, letting it roll off his tongue as if it were a fine, aged whiskey. "You are not from around here, are you, Sophie?" "Everyone comes from somewhere, Mr. Moretti. For tonight, I am simply from table 4. Alessandro held her gaze for another long, weighty moment. Then he snapped the wine list shut. "Bring me the Rothschild," he ordered, his eyes never leaving hers. "And bring a second glass." Camilla immediately brightened. "Oh, Alessandro, you are far too generous." "That glass is not for you," Alessandro said, his voice like ice, cutting her off completely. He gestured toward the empty chair across from his own, the one right next to Camilla. "It is for her." He aimed his finger directly at Sophie. "Sit down, Sophie." A collective gasp swept through the entire restaurant. A waitress being invited to sit with the Don himself. It was completely unheard of. It was a death wish. "Sir, I am unable to do that." Sophie stammered, the surge of adrenaline now giving way to a wave of pure terror. "My shift is not over. Monsieur Laurent will dismiss me." Alessandro turned his head just enough to look at the horrifyingly pale manager, who was standing paralyzed about 5 feet away. "Laurent," Alessandro said with chilling calm, "Sophie is finished. She is finished with her shift. From this moment on, she is dining with me. Put everything on my tab, and if she loses her job over this, Le Noir will be a pile of ash by morning. Do you understand?" Laurent nodded so violently his glasses almost flew from his face. Yes, Mr. Moretti. Absolutely. Sophie, please, have a seat. Sophie glanced at the empty chair, then at the furious, humiliated face of Camilla, and finally into the dark, bottomless eyes of Alessandro Moretti. She sat down. In that single moment, her old life ended, and her new one truly began. The chair was covered in soft, expensive velvet, a world away from the hard wooden stool in the break room where she usually ate her stale bread. But she could not feel its softness. All she could feel was the intense weight of Alessandro Moretti's gaze. It was a heavy, physical pressure, like a hand closing around her throat. Across from her, Camilla Russo looked as if she had just swallowed an entire lemon. Her face was a cracking mask of expensive makeup and pure, undiluted rage. Alessandro, Camilla hissed, her voice shaking with disbelief. This has to be some kind of joke. Is this a test? You are actually letting the help sit with us? Alessandro did not even look at her. His eyes remained fixed on Sophie. Pour the wine, Sophie. Her hands trembled as she reached for the bottle of Chateau Mouton Rothschild. It was a 1982 vintage, a bottle worth more than 3 full months of her rent. She decanted it with a practiced, steady hand, letting the muscle memory from her former life guide her. She poured a small amount for Alessandro to approve. He swirled the deep crimson liquid in his glass, inhaled its complex aroma, and then took a small sip. He gave a slight nod. Sophie filled his glass, and then she filled her own. She deliberately ignored Camilla's empty glass. "You are ignoring me!" Camilla shrieked, slamming her palm down on the table with a crash. The silverware jumped. "I am the daughter of Senator Russo. My father is going to—" "Your father," Alessandro interrupted, his voice a low, bored drawl, "owes me 3 very large favors and $4 million. If I were to tell him I abandoned you on a street corner because your voice annoyed me, he would likely send me a personal apology for the trouble you caused." Camilla's jaw dropped. "Sophie," Alessandro continued, turning his complete attention back to her. "Tell me your thoughts on the wine." Sophie took a sip. The flavor was like a ghost on her tongue, a memory of a life long gone. Black currant, cedar, the faint scent of a cigar box. It tasted like her father's study before the police kicked in the door. It tasted of safety. "It is bold," Sophie said, her voice barely a whisper. "The structure is perfect. The tannins have mellowed with time, but they still have a firm presence. It has a very long finish. It is a survivor." "A survivor," Alessandro echoed, his eyes studying her face. "Like you?" Sophie carefully set her glass down. "I am not sure what you mean, sir." "Oh, please," Camilla scoffed, pushing her chair back and standing up. She clutched her purse, her knuckles showing white. "I am not staying to watch this ridiculous performance. If you want to eat with this rat, fine. I hope you catch fleas." She turned to make a dramatic exit, but paused to grab her full glass of water. With a hateful sneer, she threw the entire contents directly at Sophie. It all seemed to happen in slow motion. Sophie flinched and squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the icy shock of the water. But it never came. She cautiously opened her eyes. Alessandro had moved with a speed that seemed to defy logic. His hand was raised, blocking the entire spray of water. The liquid dripped from the sleeve of his expensive suit jacket onto the white tablecloth. He had not spilled a single drop of his own wine. The entire restaurant fell deathly silent once more. Even the sounds from the kitchen had stopped. Alessandro rose slowly to his feet. He took off his soaked jacket and handed it to one of his stone-faced bodyguards. Then, his gaze fell upon Camilla. "Leave," he whispered. It was not a shout. It was a quiet, final sound, like a coffin lid being sealed shut. Camilla's face went white with terror, the reality sinking in that she had just assaulted a powerful crime boss. She spun around and ran, the frantic clicking of her heels on the hardwood floor echoing until she disappeared out into the rainy night. Alessandro sat back down. He was now just in his dress shirt, the fine white fabric straining against his broad shoulders. A gun holster was clearly visible under his left arm. He made no effort to conceal it. "My apologies," he said directly to Sophie. "The trash has now been taken out." Sophie just stared at him, bewildered. "Why did you do that for me?" "Because you can tell the difference between a Muscadet and a Bordeaux," he said, as he cut into a piece of his steak. "And because you have the eyes of a woman who is desperately running from something, and I truly despise wasted potential." He took a bite, chewed it slowly, then aimed his fork in her direction. "Eat. You look like you have not had a decent source of protein in at least a week." Sophie slowly picked up her own fork. She was famished. The aroma of the ribeye was dizzying. She took a bite, forcing herself not to groan with pleasure. "So," Alessandro said, swirling the wine in his glass. "Sophie, who has no last name, speaks perfect French, possesses an expert knowledge of expensive vintages, and is working a dead-end job where her manager terrifies her. Let me guess." He leaned forward across the table, his dark eyes narrowing into slits. "Disgraced socialite? No, you are too tough for that. A runaway wife, perhaps? No, there is no ring mark on your finger. That leaves only one real possibility: family trouble." Sophie froze solid. She carefully placed her fork back on the table. "I am just a waitress, Mr. Moretti." Liar. He smiled then. It was the smile of a wolf, all perfect predatory white teeth. "You are Arthur Dubois's daughter." The wine glass slipped from Sophie's numb fingers. It hit the table and shattered into pieces. The red wine, the precious 1982 Rothschild, bled across the white linen like a fresh gunshot wound. "How?" Sophie whispered, the blood in her veins turning to ice. "How could you possibly know that name?" "Your father was a legend in the smuggling world," Alessandro said, completely unfazed by the spreading red stain. He signaled for Laurent to bring a napkin. He moved priceless art, rare gems, secret information. They called him the diplomat. Then, 3 years ago, he disappeared with something extremely valuable, something that did not belong to him. Alessandro's expression grew hard as stone, something that belonged to the Moretti family. Sophie shoved her chair back from the table, raw panic clawing its way up her throat. "I do not know where he is. I swear I have not seen him in 3 years. Please, I just want to go home." "You cannot go home, Sophie," Alessandro said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "Why not?" "Because if I was able to find you," he said, nodding toward the dark sport utility vehicles idling in the rain outside, "then that means Stefano Greco has found you too. And unlike me, Greco does not appreciate fine wine. He prefers blood." As if summoned by his name, the entire front window of Le Val Noir exploded inward. It was not a crash, it was a detonation of crystal. Shards of glass flew through the dining room like a shower of deadly diamonds. Screams erupted as patrons scrambled and dove under tables for cover. Sophie did not even have time to scream. Before her mind could fully register the drive-by shooting, a heavy weight slammed into her, knocking her and her chair backward onto the floor. Alessandro was on top of her, his body acting as a human shield. She felt the hard warmth of his chest, and the smell of gunpowder and expensive cologne filled her nostrils. Pop, 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 pop. A burst of bullets shredded the velvet upholstery of the booth where they had just been sitting. Behind the bar, bottles of liquor exploded one by one, raining alcohol and glass down on the terrified, cowering bartender. "Stay down!" Alessandro roared, his voice a powerful command that cut through the noise. The sound of chaos was deafening, but he calmly pulled a sleek, matte black pistol from his holster. He fired 3 controlled shots toward the shattered window, providing suppressing fire against their attackers. "Dante, the back door!" Alessandro barked. One of the bodyguards, a man named Dante, was already moving, flipping a heavy dining table for cover and firing back. Sophie was shaking so violently her teeth were chattering. "What is happening?" Who are those people? Greco! Alessandro spat the name like a curse. He looked down at her, his face just inches from hers. A thin line of blood trickled down his cheek from a small cut made by flying glass. He wants you. He is convinced that you have the key. The key to what? I do not have anything, Sophie cried, tears of terror and confusion streaking through the dust on her face. We have to move now. Alessandro grabbed her arm, his grip like a steel vice. He hauled her to her feet, keeping her bent low as they ran for the kitchen. They burst through the swinging doors, shocking the chefs into silence. Out the back! Go now! Alessandro ordered the staff. They did not need to be told twice. The entire kitchen crew fled into the alley. Alessandro dragged Sophie through the hot steam and grease, out the heavy steel rear door, and into the rain-soaked alleyway. A black, armored sport utility vehicle screeched to a halt right in front of them. The side door slid open instantly. Get in. Alessandro practically threw her inside and then dove in right behind her. The tires screamed and smoked against the wet asphalt as the car peeled away, just as a motorcycle rounded the corner. Its rider was already raising a submachine gun. A spray of bullets pinged harmlessly off the reinforced glass of the SUV. Sophie sat huddled in the far corner of the plush leather seat, hugging her knees to her chest. She was drenched, shivering, and in a state of deep shock. Alessandro sat across from her. He calmly holstered his weapon and straightened the cuffs of his shirt. He looked disturbingly calm, as if he had just concluded a slightly boring business meeting instead of surviving a gunfight. Are you hit anywhere? He asked, his voice even. Sophie quickly checked herself. No, I do not think so. She looked at him. You are bleeding. Alessandro touched the cut on his cheek, then looked at the smear of blood on his fingertips. It is nothing. He opened a compartment in the armrest and took out a bottle of water and a clean towel. He tossed them to her. Clean yourself up. You look like a ghost. Sophie wiped the grime from her face. You said they want a key. What key? My father left us with nothing but mountains of debt. We lost our vineyard, the apartment in Paris. We lost everything. I have been working as a waitress for 2 years, just to afford a tiny room. Alessandro watched her closely, analyzing every flicker of her expression. He was a human lie detector, trained by the most ruthless teachers in the underworld. He could see her fear, her confusion, and her utter exhaustion. But he saw no hint of deception. Arthur did not just steal money, Sophie. He stole a ledger. It is an encrypted hard drive that contains the routing numbers for the entire East Coast Syndicate's network of offshore accounts. Greco wants it so he can take over the city. I want it to stop him. I swear I do not have it, Sophie insisted, her voice trembling. Alejandro's gaze was hard. Maybe you do not know you have it, he countered. But Arthur was a deeply sentimental man, a fool. He would have hidden it somewhere he considered safe, somewhere close to you. The luxury car slowed its pace. Sophie stared out the window, her heart pounding. The familiar lights of Manhattan were gone. They were crossing a long bridge, moving toward the dark industrial shapes of the docks. But then the car turned away from the warehouses, heading for a single high-rise that towered over the river. Where are you taking me? She asked. To my place, Alejandro answered simply. No, Sophie said, a wave of panic rising in her throat. Take me to my apartment. I have to get my things. My mother's locket is there. Alejandro let out a long, weary sigh. He tapped on the glass partition separating them from the driver. Detour to Queens, 42nd Street, he ordered. Sir, that area is not secure, rumbled the driver, a man with a neck as thick as a tree trunk. Just do it, Alessandro commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. The rest of the ride to Queens was heavy with silence. When the car stopped in front of Sophie's building, a worn brick tenement with paint peeling from its walls, Alessandro motioned for his men to stay put. I am going up with you, he stated. I can pack my own bag, Sophie retorted, fighting to hold on to the last piece of her dignity. "Sophie," Alessandro said, his voice dropping low and serious. "Look up at your door." Sophie tilted her head back and looked at the second-floor window. A light was on inside. She knew she had not left that light on. Fear shot through her as she bolted from the car. "Sophie, wait!" Alessandro cursed under his breath and sprinted after her. She flew up the stairs, taking them two at a time, her breath catching in her chest. She reached her apartment door and stopped cold. The lock was destroyed. The wood of the frame was splintered and broken. With a push, the door swung open. A scream formed in her throat but never came out. Her home had been completely gutted. The mattress was ripped open, its stuffing pouring onto the floor like entrails. Her small dresser was shattered into pieces. Her clothes had been torn from their hangers and thrown everywhere. Even the floorboards had been torn up, and the wallpaper was peeling away in long strips. "No," she whimpered, the sound barely audible. She collapsed to her knees, crawling through the wreckage of her life. "No, no, no." Her hands reached under the broken frame of her bed, searching desperately for the loose floorboard where she kept her few treasures. The space was empty. "The locket," she sobbed, her body shaking. "They took the locket. It had the only picture of my mother." Alessandro entered the ruined room behind her. He scanned the absolute destruction with a cold, professional eye. This was clearly Greco's work. It was messy, violent, and designed to send a message. He walked over to where Sophie knelt among the ruins. He offered no useless comfort. He did not tell her it would be all right. Instead, he crouched down, the fine material of his expensive suit, trousers brushing against the dirty floor. He reached out a hand and gently lifted her chin, forcing her to meet his intense gaze. "They did not find what they were looking for," Alessandro said, his voice firm. "They took everything," Sophie cried, her voice thick with despair. "They took worthless junk and trinkets. If they had found the drive, they would have burned this entire building to the ground just to hide their tracks. They are still searching." He rose to his feet and extended a hand down to her. "You have nothing left for you here, Sophie. No job, no home, no connection to your past." Sophie stared at his hand. It was large and calloused, a killer's hand. But in that moment, it was the only solid thing in a world that had completely fallen apart around her. "Come with me," Alessandro offered. "I will recover your locket. I will ensure your father's debt is finally settled. But in return, you have to belong to me now." "Belong to you?" Sophie whispered, the words catching in her throat. "Like some kind of property?" "Like a partner," Alessandro corrected her, his tone sharp. "I require your intelligence. You require my protection until Greco is dead. You are Sophie Moretti." Sophie hesitated for a long moment. Then, as the distant wail of sirens grew louder, she placed her small hand in his. He pulled her to her feet, drawing her close, and for one fleeting second, she actually felt safe. "Let us go home," he said softly. The penthouse was nothing like a home. It was a fortress built in the sky. The private elevator doors opened directly into a living room that was bigger than her entire apartment building. Walls made entirely of glass offered a breathtaking view of the glittering Manhattan skyline. The furniture was sleek, Italian, and severe. Every surface was either black, white, or chrome. It was stunningly beautiful, but also cold and overwhelmingly masculine. "Dante!" Alessandro barked as they stepped inside. "Secure the entire perimeter. Double the security detail in the lobby. Nobody comes up to this floor unless I personally authorize it. And tell the chef to prepare something light. Also, get a doctor up here." "I do not need a doctor," Sophie said, wrapping her arms around herself. She was still in her waitress uniform, which was now stained with spilled wine and covered in dust. She felt completely and utterly out of place. "You have cuts on your arms from the broken glass," Alessandro noted, loosening his tie. He walked to a fully stocked wet bar and poured 2 glasses of a dark amber liquid. He came back and handed one to her. "It is brandy. Drink it." Sophie took a small sip. The liquid burned its way down her throat, but it began to calm her frantic nerves. "There is a guest room just down the hall," Alessandro gestured. "You will find clothes in the closet. They were my sister's old things. She leaves some of them here. They should be your size. Take a shower, change your clothes, and then meet me in my study." "And what if I refuse?" Sophie challenged, a small spark of her old fire returning. Alessandro stopped and turned. He looked at her with an intensity that made her knees feel weak. "The door is not locked, Sophie. You are free to leave at any time. But out there, you are nothing but prey. In here, you are my guest. The choice is yours." He turned and walked toward a set of large, heavy double doors, leaving her standing alone in the enormous, silent room. Sophie stared back at the elevator. She could make a run for it. She could try to find the police, but the police were probably on Greco's payroll, or maybe even Alessandro's. Her father had taught her that much about the world. "There is no real law," Arthur used to tell her. "There is only power." She turned away from the elevator and walked toward the guest room. The shower felt like a waterfall, the hot water washing away the grime from the restaurant and the dust from her destroyed apartment. She scrubbed at her skin until it was red and raw. Stepping out, she found the clothes Alessandro had mentioned. There were silk blouses and cashmere sweaters. She chose a simple, oversized white shirt and a pair of black leggings. She looked at her reflection in the mirror. The girl who stared back at her looked different, somehow harder. She made her way to the study. The doors had been left open. Inside, the room was lined from floor to ceiling with books. Alessandro was sitting behind a massive mahogany desk, surrounded by glowing monitors and tall stacks of paper. He had changed into a simple black t-shirt that revealed muscular arms covered in intricate tattoos, dark ink that looked like vines and thorns wrapping around his biceps. "Better," he said, his eyes still fixed on a document. "You said you needed my brain," Sophie stated, standing stiffly in front of his desk. "I am assuming you do not need me to list wine vintages for you." Alessandro slid a single piece of paper across the polished surface of the desk. It was old and yellowed, covered in a handwritten cipher. "This is a letter your father sent to me 3 days before he disappeared," Alessandro explained. "We intercepted it, but we were never able to crack the code. My cryptographers insisted it was just gibberish, random lines of French poetry." Sophie reached out and picked up the paper. Her breath caught in her throat. She instantly recognized the handwriting, the way he looped his L's and made his T's sharp. "It is not random," she whispered. "Read it out loud." Sophie's eyes scanned the elegant script. "The moonlight shines on the forgotten vineyard, where the fox sleeps under the 9th stone," she translated softly. "We already know what it says in English," Alessandro said, his voice filled with impatience. "But it does not mean anything. There is no vineyard. There is no fox." "It is a book code," Sophie explained, her mind racing, pulling memories from her childhood. "My father, he used to read me very specific stories. The Little Prince, Les Miserables. But this," she said, tapping the paper, "the fox is a reference to Aesop's Fables, the 1890 edition. He owned a first edition that he kept in his library." Alessandro stood up from his chair. "And the 9th stone, page 9, or the 9th fable?" "The fox and the grapes," Sophie finished, looking up at Alessandro. "He was not telling you where he hid the money. He was telling you where he hid the key." "Where?" Alessandro demanded, leaning forward over the massive desk. "The forgotten vineyard," Sophie murmured, closing her eyes to focus. "When I was 10 years old, we buried a time capsule in our old vineyard in Provence, right before we lost the estate. We buried it under the 9th stone of the garden wall." Alessandro's eyes widened in realization. "Provence. The drive is in France." "If he has not moved it since then," Sophie added. "We have to go now," Alessandro said instantly. He slammed a button on his desk phone. Dante, get the jet ready. We are leaving for Marseille in 1 hour. Wait! Sophie cried out. I cannot go to France with you. I am wanted by the French authorities because of my father's debts. Alessandro walked around the desk until he was standing just inches away from her. The air between them felt charged, electric. I own the French customs officials at the Marseille airport, he said, his voice low. You will not be arrested. But you are the only person who can find that specific stone. You are the only one who knows the layout of that estate. He reached out and gently tucked a damp strand of her hair behind her ear. His touch was surprisingly gentle, a stark contrast to the violence of the night. Help me find this drive, Sophie. Help me destroy Greco, and I will give you your life back. I will clear all of your debts. I will buy you l'Étoile Noire if that is what you want. I do not want the restaurant, Sophie said, her voice barely a whisper. I want my father. A shadow passed over Alessandro's face. He glanced away for just a fraction of a second, but it was a hesitation that Sophie immediately noticed. What? She asked sharply. What are you not telling me? Sophie, is he dead? Her voice cracked on the last word. Just tell me. Alessandro put his hands on her shoulders. He is not dead. But he is not missing, is he, Sophie? He did not just run away. Then where is he? She demanded. Alessandro took a deep breath, his expression grim. He is being held in the dungeon of Stefano Greco's villa in Tuscany. He has been imprisoned there for the last 3 years. That letter was not sent right before he vanished. It was smuggled out of the villa just last week. Sophie's entire world seemed to tilt on its axis. He is alive, and you knew this whole time. I suspected, he corrected. The letter was the confirmation I needed. We have to go get him, Sophie shouted, pulling away from his grasp. Forget about the drive. We have to save him now. We cannot save him without that drive, Alessandro roared back at her. Greco is holding him as leverage specifically to get those codes. If we try to storm the villa now, he will kill your father without a second thought. The choice was an illusion, and the injustice of it was a knife in her gut. If they surrendered the drive, Greco would execute her father, Arthur. It was that simple. The only path to his survival, the only conceivable way out, was to secure that drive first. Alessandro's plan was to decode the accounts and completely freeze every asset Greco owned. If they could make him a poor man, his hired army would abandon him. Only then could they move in. Sophie could feel her heart hammering against her ribs as she stared at him. The danger had just multiplied tenfold. This was no longer just about finances or revenge. Her father's life was now the prize. She studied the man who stood before her, this powerful Mafia don, this monster of the underworld. He was, impossibly, her single greatest hope. France, Sophie declared, her voice a solid, unwavering line. We have to go to France. Alessandro gave a single, sharp nod. Get your coat. As Sophie pivoted to go, a file on the edge of his desk snagged her attention. It was slightly ajar, just enough to see. A photograph was clipped to the corner of the first page. It was a picture of her, a candid shot taken from the other side of the street, just outside Lido Noir, from 2 weeks ago. A cold dread washed over her, freezing her in place. You knew, she whispered, the words barely audible. She slowly turned back to face him, the sharp sting of betrayal already making her eyes burn. You never came to the restaurant for a meal. You came there specifically for me. Alessandro made no move to deny the accusation. He stood his ground, a towering figure framed by the dark silhouette of the city behind him. I came to determine if Arthur Dubois' daughter was going to be worth the immense trouble, he stated with unnerving calm. And? Sophie challenged, hot tears finally threatening to spill from her eyes. Am I? Alessandro closed the distance between them. He moved with a predator's grace and did not stop until his chest was a mere inch from hers. His gaze dropped to her lips, his dark eyes smoldering with a fire that was part raw possession and part something else, something that felt alarmingly like true affection. Read the menu, Sophie, he murmured, his voice a low vibration that echoed the start of their chaotic night. You, he said, his tone turning rough and deep, are worth burning the entire world to the ground for. Their private jet landed on a secluded airstrip somewhere outside Marseille as the first light of dawn began to spill across the horizon, painting the French countryside in shades of bruised violet and deep gold. The flight had been quiet, filled with an unspoken tension. Alessandro had been occupied for most of the journey, speaking on his encrypted satellite phone. He barked sharp commands in Italian to his men back in New York, while also organizing a tactical team in Tuscany. Sophie, meanwhile, had spent the hours gazing out the small window, her fingers twisting the soft fabric of the leggings he had given her mind a battlefield of fractured memories and mounting fear. An unremarkable rental car, a weathered gray Peugeot, was waiting for them on the tarmac. Alessandro took the wheel. He drove with the same focused precision and aggressive self-assurance that he applied to everything else in his life. "We are getting close," Sophie said softly, after nearly an hour of navigating winding roads flanked by tall, silent cypress trees. "You need to turn left at the next intersection. The paved road ends just after that." They followed her directions, turning onto a rugged gravel track. A faded sign, almost completely consumed by thick ivy, announced the name, Château du Bois. The estate was a ghost, a hollowed-out shell of what it had once been. The main house, which she remembered as a grand manor of warm, sun-yellow stone, was now shuttered with decaying boards, its roof sagging like a broken spine. But it was the vineyard that broke her heart. The vineyard was a wild, untamed thing. The very vines that had once yielded prize-winning Syrah grapes were now a chaotic, tangled mess, a thorny jungle that was systematically strangling all life from the rich soil beneath. "Stop the car here," Sophie whispered, her voice tight. "We need to go the rest of the way on foot. The sound of the engine will travel too far." Alessandro immediately cut the engine. He reached into the back and retrieved a heavy duffel bag. He passed a flashlight to Sophie but kept his own right hand resting firmly on the holstered weapon at his side. "Stay directly behind me," he ordered. "If you spot anyone, you immediately drop to the ground. You do not make a sound. You do not run. Do you understand me?" "I spent my childhood playing hide-and-seek between these very rows, Alessandro," Sophie replied, her voice steady as she stepped out into the crisp morning air. The familiar scent of wild thyme and damp earth filled her lungs, causing a sharp ache in her chest. "I know how to become invisible here." They advanced through the overgrown vines in near silence. The quiet was thick and heavy, punctuated only by the sharp crunch of dead leaves and twigs under their heavy boots. "The garden wall is on the northern edge of the property," Sophie directed in a low tone. They soon reached the old, crumbling stone wall that marked the estate's boundary. It was coated in a thick, velvety layer of moss. Sophie began to count the foundation stones, her breath catching in her throat. 1, 2, 3, she paused. "Here." She pointed a trembling finger at a large, flat river stone near the base of the wall, precisely the 9th stone in the row. Alessandro dropped to one knee. He drew a wicked-looking knife from his boot and carefully wedged the tip beneath the stone's edge. With a low grunt of pure physical effort, he pried it upward. Lying in the dark soil beneath was a rusted tin box, the kind that once held sweet biscuits. Sophie dropped to her knees beside him and snatched it up. Her hands were shaking so violently that she could not manage to open the tightly sealed lid. Alessandro's large, warm hands gently covered hers. "Let me." With a simple pop, he opened it. The musty smell of old paper and memories drifted out. Inside, nestled on faded cotton, were childhood treasures. A single dried flower, a small, painted toy soldier. There was also a childish drawing of a horse, and securely taped to the very bottom of the tin was a slim, silver USB drive. "He did it," Sophie breathed, relief causing tears to finally spill down her cheeks. "He actually hid it here all this time." "Secure it," Alessandro commanded, his gaze methodically sweeping the dark, silent tree line. We have what we came for. Now we leave. A sharp click echoed through the quiet vineyard. It was the unmistakable metallic sound of a gun's hammer being pulled back. Do not move. A mocking voice slithered out from the darkness between the vines. And drop the weapon, Moretti, unless you want this girl's pretty brains to end up fertilizing these pathetic grapes. Alessandro's body went completely rigid. With deliberate slowness, he raised his empty hands into the air. From the shadows, 3 men emerged. Their leader was a brute, a mountain of muscle. A thick scar sliced through his left eyebrow, giving him a permanently menacing look. He aimed a suppressed MP5 submachine gun squarely at Sophie's heart. Luca, Alessandro said, his tone surprisingly calm, almost bored. I see that Greco finally decided to let you off your leash. He knew you would come for the girl's inheritance, Luca sneered with a triumphant grin. Now, hand over the drive. Or what, exactly? Alessandro challenged. Or I put a bullet in her, take the drive anyway, and leave your corpse here for the crows to pick apart. Alessandro's dark eyes locked onto Sophie's. In that fleeting moment, he conveyed a clear, silent command. Trust me. Fine, Alessandro announced. He reached into the tin, plucked out the drive, and held it up for them to see. The silver casing caught the first rays of morning light. You want it so badly, he called out. Then catch. In a sudden, swift motion, Alessandro hurled the drive high into the air, aiming it toward the densest part of the thorny thicket to his right. Luca's gaze, and that of his men, instinctively darted upward to follow the arc of the glittering silver object. That single, split-second distraction was everything Alessandro required. He ignored his own weapon. Instead, he lunged directly at Sophie, tackling her hard and driving her down into the dirt behind the stone wall just as Luca opened fire. A spray of bullets hammered the ancient stone, chipping fragments just inches above where their heads had been. Stay down! Alessandro roared. He rolled onto his back, pulling his pistol from its holster in one seamless motion and firing 3 rounds blindly over the top of the wall. A pained scream tore through the morning air. One of the henchmen crumpled to the ground. Get to the vines now, Alessandro commanded. He grabbed Sophie by the collar of her jacket and hauled her into the thick, protective cover of the overgrown vineyard. They scrambled desperately on their hands and knees through the rough soil, sharp thorns ripping at Sophie's clothes and scratching her skin. Behind them, the heavy crunch of footsteps grew closer. Spread out and find them, Luca yelled in fury. The drive, Sophie hissed, raw panic finally seizing her. You threw it away. I threw the toy soldier, Alessandro gritted out, expertly reloading his clip while they huddled behind the thick, gnarled trunk of an ancient vine. He tapped his breast pocket with the fresh magazine. The drive is right here. Sophie stared at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. You are completely insane. I am practical. Now listen to me very carefully. I am going to create a diversion, draw their fire. When I do, you run for the car. You do not stop and you do not look back. No, Sophie clutched his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. I am not leaving you here. Alessandro looked at her then, and for just a heartbeat, the carefully constructed mask of the unfeeling Dawn slipped away. It revealed a man who was terrified of losing the one thing of value he had just managed to find. Sophie, I am begging you. They are flanking to our left, Sophie whispered, her hearing perfectly attuned to the subtle sounds of the vineyard she had known her entire life. She pointed. There is an old dry irrigation ditch about 10 yards in that direction. It runs all the way back to the road. We can both make it out of here. Alessandro followed the line of her gesture. He then turned back to her, a fierce, wild grin spreading across his face. Lead the way, mademoiselle. They moved as one, a perfectly synchronized unit born of desperation. They dove headfirst into the dry ditch just as a hail of bullets ripped through the exact spot where they had been hiding. They ran hunched low to the ground, their lungs burning, until the dusty silhouette of the Peugeot came into view. Alessandro vaulted over the door and into the driver's seat, while Sophie scrambled into the passenger side. He roared the engine to life, spinning the car around in a chaotic spray of dirt and gravel, just as Luca and his remaining man burst from the tree line, firing their weapons wildly. The rear windshield exploded into 1,000 tiny pieces. Sophie screamed and ducked down. Alessandro slammed the Peugeot into gear and stomped on the accelerator. The small car surged down the dirt track, leaving the furious gunman disappearing in a cloud of dust. "Are you hit?" Alessandro yelled, his voice barely audible over the roar of the wind whipping through the shattered back window. "No!" Sophie quickly checked herself. She was bleeding from dozens of scratches from the thorns, but there were no bullet holes. She looked over at Alessandro. He was grinning, a wide, manic grin fueled by pure adrenaline. "You did well, Sophie," he laughed, a genuine, startling sound. "You did very, very well." Sophie looked at the man beside her. He was dangerous, he was lethal, and in that moment, he was the most exhilarating thing she had ever experienced. "To Tuscany?" she asked, her own voice finding its steady rhythm again. Alessandro's wild grin vanished, instantly replaced by a look of cold, hard determination. "To Tuscany," he confirmed, "to kill a monster." Stefano Greco's magnificent villa was a fortress constructed with blood money, perched elegantly in the rolling, picturesque hills of Tuscany. It was a place of breathtaking, ancient beauty that was rotting from the inside with corruption. Full darkness had fallen by the time Alessandro and Sophie arrived. This time, there was no sneaking around. They drove directly to the massive front gate in a sleek black Mercedes that one of Alessandro's contacts had arranged. Alessandro was dressed in a fresh suit, all black. Sophie wore a striking red dress, a world away from the cheap polyester uniform from Leto Noir. It was a silk gown that Alessandro had acquired for her in Florence. She looked like a queen on her way to a coronation. She felt like a lamb being led to the slaughter. "Remember the plan," Alessandro said in a low voice as the heavy iron gates groaned open to admit them. "You are the leverage. I am here as the buyer. Under no circumstances do we show any fear." "I am not afraid," Sophie lied through her teeth. "Good," he said, "because fear is what Greco feeds on." They were escorted by heavily armed guards into the villa's main hall. It was a vast, cavernous room, lavishly decorated with priceless Renaissance art and filled with the faint, unsettling smell of sulfur. Stefano Greco sat at the far end of a long, polished banquet table. He was a small, oily-looking man with empty, dead eyes and a smile that revealed far too much of his gums. "Alessandro," Greco said, spreading his arms in a gesture of false welcome, "and the lovely little waitress, welcome to my home. I do trust your flight was comfortable." "Let's cut the pleasantries, Stefano." Alessandro's voice was cold steel, echoing off the high stone walls of the chamber. He refused to sit. Instead, he stood directly behind Sophie's chair, placing a large protective hand on her shoulder. "We have the drive." "Do you now?" Greco purred, taking a slow sip of his red wine. "Show it to me." Alessandro retrieved the silver USB from his inner pocket and placed it firmly on the center of the table. "Arthur Dubois. Release him." Greco snapped his fingers. A side door creaked open. Two of his guards appeared, dragging a beaten man between them. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. "Papa?" Model. The man before her was a ghost. Arthur Dubois had been hollowed out, his body a canvas of dark bruises and his face distorted, one eye swollen completely shut. Each step was a battle as he faltered forward, barely staying upright. This is what happens when you are powerless. Power is the only shield that matters, and he had lost his. Keep watching to see how it can be taken back. "Sophie," he managed to rasp, forcing his head up. "No, you must run, Sophie, please." "Let him go now," Sophie heard herself say, her body tensing as she began to stand. Alessandro's hand clamped down, keeping her in her chair. "First, the drive," Greco said with a cold smile, retrieving the small USB stick. He inserted it into a laptop on the table, his fingers tapping for a second before his expression soured. "It is encrypted," Greco hissed. "Biometric lock, requires voice recognition." His gaze fell upon Sophie, full of cruel understanding. "How clever of you, Arthur," Greco sneered. "You made your own daughter the key." Alessandro's grip on Sophie's shoulder became a vice, his fingers digging into her skin. "She will give us access, but only after Arthur is safely in a car and on his way to the airport." Greco let out a laugh, a dry, rattling sound from deep in his chest. "You are in no position to make demands, boy. I have 50 of my men surrounding this property." "You brought a waitress." As if to prove his point, Greco produced a pistol from beneath the table, aiming it squarely at Arthur's temple. "Unlock the drive for me, Sophie, or your father is going to redecorate that wall." "No!" Sophie shrieked, her voice cracking with terror. "Do it now!" Greco commanded, pulling back the hammer with a sharp click. Sophie's eyes darted to Alessandro. His face was a mask of cold indifference, but she felt his hand on her shoulder squeeze twice. It was a deliberate, hidden signal. Sophie pushed her chair back and rose to her feet. The walk to the other end of the table felt like a mile, with the stare of every single guard following her every move. She felt completely exposed, a target in a room of hunters. She bent over the laptop, where a prompt awaited a specific voice phrase. Locking her gaze with Greco's, she challenged him. "Is this what you want? The code?" "I desire the entire world, my dear," he purred. "Now give it to me." Sophie leaned toward the device's microphone. In perfect French, she spoke with clarity and purpose. "The fox knows many tricks, but the hedgehog knows one big one." The screen immediately flashed a vibrant green, displaying the words, "Access granted." A flood of information began to cascade down the screen, revealing bank accounts, untraceable routing numbers, and the complete architectural blueprint of Greco's entire syndicate. His eyes widened, consumed by pure, unadulterated greed. "Yes," he whispered, his voice trembling with excitement. "Yes, it is all here." His head snapped up, his gaze finding his guards. "Kill them both! Kill all of them!" Sophie's blood ran cold. "A deal is a deal, Stefano." Alessandro's voice dropped, becoming a low and menacing growl that promised violence. Greco just laughed, his attention glued to the flow of data on the screen. "I am a criminal, Alessandro. I do not make deals. I create corpses." "So do I," Alessandro replied. And in that instant, the room plunged into absolute darkness. Utter chaos followed. Alessandro was already in motion before the lights had fully died, having activated a remote trigger in his pocket that cut the main power, a timer he had set the very instant Sophie uttered the code. The pitch-black room exploded with the sound of gunfire. Alessandro threw himself at Sophie, his body covering hers as he fired 3 precise shots toward Greco's men. He was wearing night vision contacts. They were completely blind. "Get your father," Alessandro commanded, his voice a roar in the darkness. Sophie scrambled desperately across the cold floor, crawling frantically toward the spot where she had last seen her father. "Papa, Papa," she whispered, her hands finding his frail one in the dark. "I have you, Sophie," Arthur wheezed, his breath shallow. "You have to go, not without you." Just then, the emergency lights flickered to life, casting an eerie, dim red glow over the scene, bathing everything in the color of spilled blood. Alessandro was a specter of violence, a blur of deadly motion. His actions were brutally efficient, a master at work. He broke one man's arm, used him as a human shield against another, and systematically cleared a path to the door. But Greco had vanished. The laptop was also gone. "He ran!" Alessandro yelled above the noise. "Get your father to the car. Dante is waiting for you at the rear gate." "Where are you going?" Sophie screamed, struggling to pull her father to his feet. "To finish this," Alessandro stated, then turned and sprinted through a side door. Sophie dragged her father through the wreckage of the room, dodging overturned furniture. They burst out into the courtyard where the Mercedes was idling. Dante, their loyal bodyguard, was laying down cover fire. "Get inside!" Dante shouted. Sophie managed to shove her father into the safety of the back seat, but she did not follow him. She stood frozen, looking back at the villa as more gunshots echoed from within. "Go!" Sophie commanded, slamming the car door shut. "Just get him to safety." "Sophie, no!" she heard her father scream from the car. "Drive, Dante!" Sophie ordered with absolute authority. The car peeled away, tires squealing on the gravel. Sophie turned and ran straight back into the heart of the villa. She was no longer a waitress. She was no longer a victim. She was a woman in love with a dangerous king, and she refused to let him die by himself. She located them in the library. Greco was cowering behind a massive oak desk, clutching the laptop. Alessandro was taking cover behind a marble pillar, obviously low on ammunition. "It is over, Alessandro," Greco taunted. "I have all the accounts. The funds are being transferred as we speak." "You are left with nothing," Alessandro shouted back. Sophie saw Greco's finger poised directly over the enter key, ready to complete the transaction. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for anything she could use. She saw it. A heavy bronze bust of Julius Caesar perched on a high shelf right above Greco's head. That shelf was supported by just a single wooden bracket. Sophie had no weapon. All she had was a heavy magnum bottle of wine she had snatched from a table on her way in. There was no time to think. She simply acted. She launched the bottle with every ounce of strength she possessed. Her target was not Greco, it was the wooden bracket. The bottle shattered against the wood with a tremendous crash. The bracket splintered and broke. The heavy bronze bust tipped forward and plummeted, crashing down onto Greco's arm with a sickening, wet crunch. Greco let out a piercing scream of agony, dropping the laptop as the gun flew from his shattered hand. Alessandro immediately stepped out from behind the pillar. There was no hesitation in his movement. He raised his pistol and fired a single, final, deafening shot. Stefano Greco collapsed forward over the desk, and profound silence descended upon the room. Alessandro stood perfectly still, his chest rising and falling heavily. He looked from the dead man to the laptop, and then his eyes found Sophie, standing in the doorway, breathless, her red dress torn, her hands now empty. He crossed the room to her, said nothing, and pulled her face into his hands, kissing her with fierce intensity. It was a kiss born from survival and fueled by adrenaline, a kiss of absolute possession that tasted of gunpowder and victory. He eventually pulled away, resting his forehead against hers. "I gave you an order to get in the car," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I do not take orders very well," Sophie whispered back, a faint smile on her lips. "I am French." A short, breathy laugh escaped Alessandro. His gaze shifted to the laptop lying on the floor. "He never transferred the money, did he?" Sophie asked. "No," Alessandro confirmed, "because the code phrase you spoke did not unlock the funds. It uploaded a custom virus that has just finished erasing every single server he owned. He died a completely broke man." Sophie let a genuine smile spread across her face. "The hedgehog knows one big trick," she repeated softly. Alessandro scooped her up into his arms, easily ignoring her protests. "We are going home, Sophie. I am starving." 6 months later, the Manhattan rain was a gentle mist. Inside the restaurant Le Cygne Noir, the evening was alive with a vibrant energy. The establishment was now under new management. Sophie moved with confidence between the tables, not as a server waiting on others, but as the owner. She wore an elegant, tailored suit, her posture radiating authority. She paused at table 4, where Arthur Dubois sat looking robust and healthy, calmly sipping tea and reading a newspaper. He looked up and smiled warmly at his daughter. "The inventory is all finished, Papa," Sophie reported, leaning down to kiss his cheek. "Good," he said. "Now go. He is waiting for you." Sophie made her way to the private booth in the back. Alessandro Moretti was seated there. He was not in a suit this evening, but a casual sweater that made him look younger, somehow lighter. The dangerous darkness that once resided in his eyes had been replaced by a steady, comforting warmth. A bottle of wine rested on the table. Chateau Mouton Rothschild, 1982, Sophie observed as she sat opposite him. That is a bold choice for a Tuesday. I am celebrating something, Alessandro said simply. And what exactly are we celebrating? Sophie asked. Alessandro reached into his coat pocket. He did not pull out a weapon. He did not retrieve a USB drive. Instead, he placed a small, dark blue velvet box on the table between them. I have finally found a woman who can read the entire menu, he said, the corner of his mouth turning up in a smirk. And I have no intention of ever letting her dine by herself again. Sophie's gaze flickered from the small box back to his eyes. Is that supposed to be a command, Mr. Moretti? No. It is a proposal, Sophie. Sophie smiled, and it was the very same smile that had once brought a criminal empire to its knees. She reached for her wine glass. Then you should pour the wine, Alessandro. It seems we have a great deal to discuss. And that was the story of how Sophie Dubois transformed from the overlooked girl at table 4 into the undisputed queen of the New York underworld. She demonstrated that real power does not come from the end of a gun or from brute strength. It is about keen intelligence, unwavering courage, and knowing the perfect wine to serve alongside revenge. Alessandro Moretti started that night thinking he was rescuing her, but when it was all over, he realized she was the one who had truly rescued him. If you enjoyed this tale of danger, love, and perfectly served justice, please go ahead and hit that like button. Your support really does help this channel grow. Remember to subscribe and turn on your notifications so you will never miss another story. Let me know in the comments below, if you were in Sophie's shoes, would you have run back into that villa? I look forward to seeing you all in the next video. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to bring you meaningful lessons and genuine inspiration. Thank you for being here.